Hello everyone, CorpseKid369 here, and welcome back to the channel. I know I've been gone for a little bit, but I'm back with the milk and ready to waste your time with more niche Warframe knowledge. Today's video was originally going to be an explanation of every status effect in the game, but I ran into two problems. The first was that I was retreading a lot of ground from the status tier list video, which, aside from some changes in recent times, is still mostly accurate. The second was that I just kept broadening my definition of a status effect, and realized that I was never going to actually finish this video. Regardless of that though, there was still some really interesting stuff in my research that I wanted to talk about, so I thought I'd condense it down to only the stuff I liked the most. As a fair warning though, this video will be a lot of simulacrum footage, so I hope you weren't expecting much visual stimulation. Just, I don't know, put on some GTA or Family Guy to hold your attention, that seems popular these days. When it comes to talking about weird status effects, I'm not going to be referring to anything tied to a damage type. Plenty of stuff about more conventional status effects is weird, absolutely, but I cover that in the other video and I feel like I'd waste time repeating it. Instead, I want to start by talking about a relatively unknown mod that gave me the idea for this video in the first place, Reflection. Reflection is a mod for Warframes whose description confused me when I first read it. 40% chance to stagger on block, 10% chance to stun on block. When I first saw this, I thought, what exactly is the difference? Even the wiki didn't have too much information on it, so I decided to do some digging myself. A stagger, in simplest terms, is an animation where the enemy briefly staggers backwards. Real shocker, I know. The enemy can't do much of anything during the duration of the stagger, though the flinch can make landing headshots and the like more difficult. The easiest way to access a stagger is through the impact status, but some other stuff, like Reflection, can also inflict stagger. In general, the duration of a stagger is relatively short, being only about a second or two, though for impact specifically, the duration of the stagger increases with the amount of impact procs on the enemy. There's also a special type of stagger called a big stagger, which, aside from being remarkably uncreative, is also quite rare. It's the same as a regular stagger, but lasts considerably longer. As far as I know, the only way to inflict a big stagger is to shoot an enemy with either an Opticore variant or a Vulkar variant. Stun, on the other hand, is really just a more powerful stagger. Enemies that are stunned stagger for a longer duration, closer to 4 or 5 seconds. While stunned, enemies are also open to finishers, which is the main difference between a stun and a stagger. Strangely enough, parrying an enemy is also tracked like a separate status effect, but it seems to just inflict a stun. For those who don't know, when blocking an enemy melee attack, you have a chance to parry them, which stuns them and opens them to finishers. It seems that the game considers this a separate status effect, but I haven't found any difference between a parry and a stun. That is until Duviri drops and makes this part of the video pointless. Aside from parries and Reflection, enemies can also be stunned by the Dizzying Rounds augment for the Bronco. For both stagger and stun, as well as their variations, enemies with Overguard are immune to them, as they're considered a crowd control method. Our next topic of discussion is another pair of status effects, being Knockdown and Lifted. One of these is pretty simple, while the other isn't, so let's start with the easy one. Knockdown is, as the name implies, a condition where the enemy is knocked down. They'll typically remain on the ground for a few seconds before getting back up, during which they're vulnerable to ground finishers. One source of this I find to be really weird is the Malicious Code Parazon mod, which makes enemies cower in fear after doing a mercy. Except, instead of cowering in fear, they just kinda roll around on the floor. Yeah, this mod is strange. Players can also be knocked down by a lot of stuff, like ground slams, arson fire blasts, and blitz explosions. This knockdown can be cancelled early if the player jumps at the right time, though if they don't, they can press jump while on the ground to do a neutral getup, or press a direction to do a rolling getup in that direction. There's also a more advanced form of a knockdown, being a full ragdoll. In this state, enemies act like they're in Gmod, often going flying in the process. While this can be annoying, as enemies are usually displaced a lot more than they would be with a knockdown, they also can't start getting up until they've settled, so they're normally crowd controlled for considerably longer. Ragdolling enemies can be done with a ton of different things. Sonicore, Vortex, Strangledome, Balefire while overshields are active, lots of stuff. It's also super funny, which is a huge plus. I'm gonna be real with you all. Does anyone else ever find it annoying that, like... What the fuck? Dude blasted off! Holy shit! What was that whimsical ass shit? Holy fuck! Oh shit! Oh god! When using a cage ride, you can even do it to yourself, which is arguably even funnier. For both Knockdown and Ragdoll, enemies with Overguard are immune until their Overguard is removed. The thing about Knockdown and Ragdoll that ties them to Lifted is that they can't all be active at the same time, and that's important because they both count as a status effect for Condition Overload. Side note, when I'm referring to Condition Overload, I am referring to all mods with the base damage increase based on individual status effect count. So anything that works for Condition Overload also works for Galvanized Shot, Aptitude, and Savvy. Lifted also can't affect enemies with Overguard because it counts as CC too. So, moving on from the simple stuff, let's talk about Lifted. Big thanks to Red Pixel for doing a lot of testing with Lifted and lending his notes for this video. I'll be sure to visit you in the psych ward. Lifted is a status effect obtained almost exclusively through the melee system, lifting enemies into the air and ragdolling them. Lifted can be accessed by some melee combos, but is most often accessed through melee heavy slams and certain heavy attacks. When accessed through a heavy slam or heavy attack, the duration of the lift scales with combo counter, being 1 second at base and going up by 1 second for every combo level. Okay, now on to the weird stuff. If an enemy is in the lifted state, any attack that normally causes lifted will break it, dropping them to the ground in a ragdoll. Even stranger, any attack that isn't a melee will also break the lifted status. I mentioned a moment ago that lifted is almost exclusively obtained through melee, and the reason I said almost is because it can be accessed through one ability, Sentient Wrath. I thought Titania Spellbind would do it too, but it doesn't count for Condition Overload, and enemies hit by guns don't break the status, which does make sense. Spellbind has been in the game for longer than lifted. Anyways, Caliban's lifted duration scales with his ability duration, and like normal lifted, damage from his guns or abilities will end the effect early. The extra damage tied to the ability itself does not seem to end when an enemy falls out of the lifted state though, so there's that I guess. Razor Gyre also doesn't knock enemies out of lifted unless you dash into them, and repeated casts of Sentient Wrath don't end the lifted early either. Man, I'm sure glad that if I cast Sentient Wrath and then Fusion Strike, I immediately end the lifted state on all affected enemies. Thank you, Ability Screen Tooltips, you never let me down. Another weird interaction I wanted to mention real quick is with Limbo's Stasis. Enemies can be lifted while trapped in stasis, though when the effect ends, they'll just fall to the ground in a ragdoll and never get up. Normally being stuck in this state for too long would kill an enemy outright, but in this case it doesn't seem to. Moving on from Knockdown, Ragdoll, and Lifted, we've got a very niche but still noteworthy status effect, Microwave. Microwave is a status effect exclusive to the new core family, enlarging whatever body part was hit at the time of the status effect. Microwave stacks have infinite duration, and most importantly, they count as an individual status for Condition Overload, effectively giving the new core a free damage boost when used with Galvanized Shot. Or, you know, it gives a free damage boost to another weapon if you're using it as a primer. I imagine some of you will hear about this body part enlargement and think, can I use that on my dick? Wait, doesn't Peculiar Growth do that? And while Growth does enlarge body parts, that is separate from Microwave. It doesn't count towards Condition Overload, and the enlargement effect is a lot more pronounced. It does make landing headshots easier though, so there's that I guess. Disarmed is a status effect where enemies lose their ranged weapons, getting reduced to a melee. For the Grineer, this is generally a sheath, and for the Corpus, they get the funny stun stick. Disarming a melee unit typically doesn't do anything, and while it does rip the arms off of some infested, they can still melee you for some reason. There is a strange exception to this rule though, being the Tusk Reaver. If you disarm a Tusk Reaver, they'll lose their hammer despite being a melee unit, and this also locks them out of using their jetpack. Other similar units, like the Bailiff, don't do this, so I'm not really sure why they're the exception. Unlike the other statuses we've talked about up to this point, Disarm does not count towards Condition Overload. It's also worth noting that enemies with Overguard can't be disarmed, as it is also considered a crowd control method. Enemies can be disarmed in a handful of ways. Loki's Radial Disarm, obviously, Desolate Hands, Grasp of Lock, the Thrown Attack of the Halakar family, and Venari's Protect form. Which is honestly garbage, as she only disarms one enemy at a time, and her offensive form is better crowd control because it traps the enemy, but why do you suck? Sorry about that, I got a bit heated there. While not exactly the same as a full-on disarm, there is an adjacent status effect called Jammed. Well, I'm calling it Jammed, because that's what happens. Enemies have their guns jam, causing them to hold still and fiddle with them for a bit to get them working again. Unlike Disarmed though, they can resume use of the gun once the effect ends. Jamming an enemy weapon is only possible with Mesa's Shooting Gallery and Mag's Counterpulse Augment, though Shooting Gallery stun is fixed while Mag's scales with duration mods. Like Disarmed, jammed weapons don't count towards condition overload, but unlike Disarmed, enemies with Overguard can be jammed. Last thing I want to mention about Disarmed is that, unfortunately, it can be applied to players. This bastard will use the Halakar to swipe your equipped weapon, requiring you to walk over it and pick it back up manually. Drockmasters can't steal your melee weapons though, and you can outright block their attempts at a gun snatch if you have it equipped. Our next status effects once again come in a pair: Slow and Speed. These are a bit weird because they tie into other stuff as opposed to just being a status on their own, but the game does track them as their own status. They don't count towards condition overload, which is going to be a trend from here on out, so I'm not going to bring it up anymore. The status is also called PT_glue in the game files, which I just find kinda funny. Starting with Slow, enemies will have their movement speed, attack speed, and fire rate reduced. This can be accessed through the Cold status, as well as Molecular Prime, Gloom, Temporal Drag, and a bunch of other stuff. Titania's Entangle slows enemies too, but breaking from convention, it only slows their movement speed, leaving their attack speed and fire rate unchanged. Slowed enemies normally have all of their animations slowed, so effects like knockdowns and staggers are prolonged significantly, though stuff that isn't tied to an animation, like, well, any regular status effect, doesn't get prolonged. Typically, slow effects don't work on enemies with Overguard, but some can. Cold procs still work, but they're capped at 4 stacks instead of the usual 8. Rhino's Stomp and the Ice Wave Impedance Augment are both able to slow enemies with Overguard as well, as can Temporal Drag. Flipping the script, some abilities actually speed enemies up, increasing their movement speed, attack speed, and fire rate. This is most easily accessed through Equinox's Rage or through Molecular Prime when power strength is below 70%. This can be helpful for speeding up certain mission types, namely defense, though if your team doesn't have the firepower to keep up, this can be more of a detriment. You'd think making enemies faster in general would be a detriment, but that's just one of the many weird things about Warframe. Sometimes, making enemies stronger actually helps you out in the end. Though it doesn't help much when your Hydron team is about as active as a fucking stillbirth. Being blinded is kind of a weird one, as its nature varies a bit depending on the source. Don't worry though, the number of inconsistencies is gonna go way up in a bit. Blinded enemies play a stun animation when they're first hit with the effect, with white smoke billowing from their eyes. Once the stun ends, enemies remain blind. While blinded, enemies cannot see the player, treating them as if they were invisible. Once again, real shocker, I know. Blind can be accessed in a few ways, most notably through Radial Blind and Radial Howl, Gara's passive, Inaros' Pocket Sand, Breach Surge, and the Out of Sight Parazon mod. For most sources of blind, enemies are vulnerable to finishers for the entire duration, while for Out of Sight and Breach Surge, their eyes just get turned off. Enemies with Overguard are immune to being blinded, and from here on out, all our further status effects are cock-blocked by Overguard unless I mention otherwise. I also want to note that players can be blinded by Executioner Doc Thul and the Denial Bursa, which... God, I fucking hate this. As we further leave behind things like rationality and focus, we arrive at Terrified. This effect is pretty rare, only being accessed through Necros' Terrify ability and the Howl precept on the Roxa Kubro. While under the effect, enemies will run away from the player, not attempting to attack them. When they get far away enough, they'll stop fleeing, but they still won't attack, and getting close to them will trigger the running again. You know, come to think of it, I have a very similar effect on women in real life. Though at least in Warframe the Grineer can't call the police. Howl additionally slows enemies, and while Terrify doesn't innately, it can with the Creeping Terrify augment. Alright, short and sweet, let's move on. Now that we're on to sleep, I want to talk about a term I'm going to be using quite a bit: root. If an enemy is rooted, that means that they're stuck in place, being unable to attack or move. A good example of this is Harrow's Condemn, which, aside from giving him shields, is a pretty pure demonstration of the effect. Not all roots stop enemies from attacking though, namely Fracturing Crush, which stops enemies from moving but does not prevent them from attacking. Rooted enemies are also generally immune to being knocked down, ragdolled, or lifted, though this isn't always the case. So, going back to sleep, this is going to be the most egregious example of inconsistencies between abilities that, on paper, all do the same thing. For all sources, being put to sleep roots enemies, with a wake-up animation once the sleep ends that CCs them for a bit longer. Enemies put to sleep also typically preserve their alert state, so if they were unalerted before the sleep, they will remain unalerted throughout its duration. But beyond that, the effects vary quite a bit based on the source, so we'll go through each of them individually and talk about what sets them apart. First up is Baruch's Lull. When enemies are put to sleep through Lull, they have a brief period where they're slowed before they finally fall asleep. While asleep, enemies are open to melee finishers, though any damage will cause them to wake up early. After falling asleep from the lull, enemies will also have their alert state reset, meaning that they're susceptible to stealth bonuses for both damage and affinity. Related to Baruch, Cobra and Crane will cause enemies to fall asleep on the first hit in a combo when used by him. This sleep does not open enemies to finishers, and they wake up from any damage, also having a shorter wake-up animation. Next is Ivara's Sleep Arrow. When put to sleep with this ability, enemies are open to finishers, though unlike Baruch, they won't wake up as soon as they take damage. Instead, they have a wake-up threshold of 50% of the HP they had at the time they were put to sleep. So, for example, if I put an enemy with 100% HP to sleep, they will wake up early if they drop below 50% health. If I put an enemy with 80% of their max HP to sleep, they'll wake up when they fall below 40% HP. If they have 50% HP when put to sleep, they'll wake up at 25%. If they start at 20%, they'll wake up at 10%. I'm sure you get the idea. Equinox's Rest is very similar to Sleep Arrow, with the same health threshold mechanic and also opening enemies to finishers. Strangely though, if you hit an enemy put to sleep by Rest a few times, they'll just crumple to the floor, which opens them to ground finishers. Enemies that hit Revenant while Mesmer Skin is active also fall asleep, though this time they aren't open to finishers. On the bright side though, there is no wake-up threshold, and they can be enthralled for no energy cost. Our next sleep source is actually kinda surprising: Mag's Counterpulse Augment. When hitting an electronic enemy, they're actually put to sleep, opening them up to finishers, but this time with no wake-up threshold. Important to note though that Ospreys, which are a very common form of robotic enemy, can't be finishered under any circumstance. The Arrow mod set is a bit of a strange one, as the duration of the sleep goes up with how many Arrow set mods you have equipped. It goes from 3 seconds at one mod, to 6 seconds at 2 mods, to 9 seconds with all 3 mods. There is a cap on the amount of enemies that you can put to sleep at once, being 5, which doesn't scale with how many mods you have equipped. While aim gliding, enemies you hit receive a mark, and once you touch the ground, they're put to sleep. Unfortunate thing is, it doesn't open enemies to finishers, and targets will immediately wake up if they take any damage, including DOTs, so if you proc slash or something, the sleep may as well not exist. Because you have to attack enemies to trigger it, you also can't use it to take advantage of stealth multipliers. The Magus Lockdown Arcane is our last sleep source, spawning a tether after you do a Void Sling that latches onto nearby enemies. Enemies are visually put to sleep, though they aren't open to finishers and there is no wake-up threshold. The nice thing about Lockdown is that enemies that are immune to sleep, like Eidolons and Acolytes, can still be locked down by the Arcane, though these enemies lower the lockdown duration from 4 seconds to 1 second if it's used on them repeatedly. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's all the sources of sleep. I don't doubt I forgot 1 or 2, but I can't find any more right now, so I'm just gonna call this good until someone points out one in the comments 5 picoseconds after this video is uploaded. Another thing I want to note about sleep real quick is a more specific interaction with conservation targets. Typically, any ability that inflicts sleep can also put a conservation target to sleep, allowing you to capture them. The duration of their sleep is tied to the duration of the ability, aside from the Trank Rifle, which puts them to sleep indefinitely. Wait, isn't that just called euthanasia? Moving on to Frozen, it's actually pretty similar to Sleep, being a generic root. It causes enemies to be frozen in place, preventing them from attacking and getting them stuck in whatever animation they were in at the time of being frozen. There also isn't any wake up or breakout animation, meaning that once freeze ends, enemies are immediately actionable again. It's got a fun visual effect, but outside of that, it doesn't really have anything special about it innately. It can be accessed through Thermal Sunder, Frost's passive, Avalanche, and Freeze. Freeze is interesting though, because it adopts the health threshold mechanic from Sleep Arrow and Rest, which... what? Like, I get it for the sleep abilities. If I was napping and somebody walked in and began to saw my leg off, I'd probably wake up. But if I'm chilling in the freezer and somebody starts sawing my leg off, I don't think I'm gonna flash thaw and start strangling them. Whatever. Before we start this section, I want to do a little drinking game. Every time I say Vitrify or any word with Vitrify as its root, take a shot. I am almost certain you will die. Anyways, Vitrified is a very similar status to Frozen, rooting enemies in place with no breakout animation. Unlike Frozen, the effect takes a second or two to set in, rapidly slowing enemies until they're completely turned to glass. Like Sleep, some special properties exist depending on the source of the vitrification. Enemies can be vitrified by coming into contact with mass vitrified during its molten state, which, again, is a real shocker. Enemies vitrified this way take additional damage from all sources, with the damage multiplier starting at 1.5 times and scaling with Gara's strength. The duration of the glass state also scales with her ability duration. The other source is the Vitrica Sword, which can shoot projectiles on aim glide attacks that vitrify enemies. When vitrified this way, enemies will grow crystals that can be shattered by slam attacks, dealing additional damage. Taking damage will cause the vitrification to end early after a brief delay, including damage from DOTs. This is still kinda strange to me logically, but I'll take it over whatever the fuck Freeze is doing. Very similar to our last statuses, Petrify is a root, causing enemies to turn to stone. It's very similar to Freeze in that enemies have no wake up or breakout animation once it ends, and they're frozen in whatever animation they were doing at the time of being petrified. What makes it interesting, though, is that it does have something innately special about it. Though as a fair word of warning, this will be kinda tricky to understand if you don't know much about damage type matchups. Oh, look at that. This is like the third time I've blatantly self-advertised in this video. When playing Atlas specifically, petrified enemies drop Rubble, which is used to heal Atlas or increases armor, though it can't do both at the same time. More broadly though, enemies who are petrified have their damage matchups modified, with every damage type going up by plus 50% to a maximum of plus 100%, though this does not work on armor. So, for example, Flesh takes 50% more damage from Toxin and 25% less damage from Gas. When petrified, this is modified to 100% more damage from Toxin and 25% more damage from Gas. With how the math shakes out, this is generally more beneficial for weaker damage types as opposed to ones that are already strong. Effects that are neutral to health types, like True and Void, also gain the 50% increase, which is especially nice for true damage as it ignores armor outright. Armor categories ignore this matchup modification effect entirely, like I said, but as the health type beneath the armor is also considered when calculating the damage, it still does boost your damage overall. It makes sense the armor is ignored though, as that would effectively double dip with Petrify and could increase armor pass-through on certain damage types to 100%, which would make them ignore armor completely. On the one hand, that would be super based, but on the other hand, it would also be pretty unbalanced. In terms of actually accessing Petrify, it can be done in two ways, through Atlas's Petrify ability, as well as the Gorgon's Metamorphic Magazine Augment. Players can also be petrified by Archon Naira, which... why? Okay, this is our last rooting effect, I swear. Stasis is a special condition that can only apply to enemies within Limbo's Rift, and only while the Stasis ability is active. You could honestly consider being in the Rift its own status effect, but I'm not going to dwell on it too much. The important thing about being rifted is that enemies inside the rift can't damage players outside the rift, and vice versa. While caught in stasis, enemies are frozen in time, which seems to also disable their AI as was seen with the whole lifted thing mentioned earlier. In addition to the enemies themselves, all enemy weapon fire, be it hit scan, beams, or projectiles, will also be frozen in time and won't damage players who come into contact with them. Enemies who aren't affected by stasis, such as those with overguard, will still have their shots frozen, but this comes with a heavy downside. There is a limit to how many projectiles can be caught by stasis. At a limit of 300 weapon fire objects, stasis will collapse completely, allowing enemies to go about business as usual. This is foreshadowed by a visual distortion effect within the rift as the limit is approached, and as you might expect, Eximus units and the like will help you rapidly approach this limit, so get rid of them quickly. Speaking of, I would like to take this as an opportunity to dispel a fairly prominent rumor. Eximus abilities can target and affect Limbo through the rift, but their weapon fire cannot. They can collapse stasis, sure, but they can't straight up shoot him through the rift. This has been told to me countless times since Angels dropped, so I just wanted to make it clear how that stuff actually works. Last important thing to note is that sentient enemies can adapt to the effects of stasis, reducing its duration each time it affects them until they ignore it completely. Their shots will still be frozen, but melee attacks like Conculus smacks will still go through. Finally, moving on from rooting abilities, next we have another short one, Dust, which is one of the 4 buffs obtainable from Titania's Tribute. While active, nearby enemies have their accuracy reduced by 50%, meaning that they have a 50% chance to miss Titania when they try to attack her. This is obviously less effective on AoE attacks. The aura radius, effect duration, and accuracy reduction are all not affected by mods, though it can stack with other sources of inaccuracy, and by that I just mean EMP aura. Enemies with Overguard can also have their accuracy reduced, both by Dust and EMP aura. This buff effectively boosts Titania's evasion, which is a weird hidden stat that affects enemy accuracy when targeting you. As this is an area around Titania that affects enemies though, as opposed to a buff to the player directly, I thought it only fair to be put in this video. I guess accuracy reduction as a whole could be counted as its own status effect, but that would mean I have to talk about Blast again, and I'd really rather not. Silence is easily one of the most complicated and misunderstood status effects in the entire game. For players, this status can only be accessed through the Silence ability, either on Banshee or any other frame if subsumed. Enemies will play a stun animation when they're first hit with the ability, which can be re-triggered by having them exit and re-enter the radius. Well, technically it's a stagger because they aren't open to finishers unless you're using Savage Silence, but that's besides the point. As long as an enemy is within the radius of Silence, they're completely unable to use special abilities, even if they have Overguard. What exactly is a special ability? Well, let's run through some categories. By far the broadest category are buffs that an enemy has to actively cast, like Scrambus auras, Eximus abilities, Acolyte abilities, Silver Grove Spectre abilities, and Lich and Sister abilities. Auras that are always on, like Guardian and Ancient auras, as well as the Arctic Eximus Slow aura, will remain active. For Guardians specifically though, their shield can be dispelled by silence, but not the damage reduction they provide to nearby allies. Enemies that have a passive and active component will only have the active one suppressed. For example, Regulators will not buff nearby allies, but they will still jam the minimap. Yes, by the way, Regulators do actually buff nearby allies. They give them a 50% damage boost and also a speed increase, apparently. Other stuff Silent Stops includes melee slams, grenade throws, all of Ambulus's abilities aside from the main gun, Scorpion and Ancient hooks, summoning of other units from stuff like the Broodmother or Juno Tech, and movement abilities like Osprey Suicide Dives and Flameblade teleports. Oddly enough, the Manic is an exception to this, being able to teleport and stealth freely. Onto some more niche interactions, Lobber Crawlers can't shoot their projectile as it's counted as an ability. Mutalisk Ospreys also can't drop any crawlers in their possession. Maggots can't latch onto the player, causing them to just die after a brief period. Sentient special abilities like the Battleless Disco Ball and the Conculus Tornado are also disabled. Like I said, it does a lot. Hey everyone, Tired Editing Cool Kid here. Something I forgot to mention in my original script read was that enemies also take longer to respond to gunfire when affected by silence. This includes both shooting at them and actually shooting them. This effect isn't as pronounced on Banshee though, as she silences all the weapons she uses innately. Our last status effect for today's video is here because it's a Conclave exclusive status effect, known as Impair. Impair disables the player's jump and slows their movement speed for 2 seconds, with there being a 2-second grace period after it expires where the affected player cannot be impaired again. This 2-second grace period also applies to knockdowns inside of Conclave specifically. Abilities like Mag's Pull and Ivara's Encumbered Arrow inflict this effect. And as I don't much care for Conclave, that's all the screen time I'm willing to give this. Let me the fuck out of here. Alright, that's everything for today's video. Like I said earlier, I had to cut a lot of stuff out to actually get this video done in a reasonable amount of time, so if you guys want to see a sequel video with a bunch of other rare and niche status effects that hardly even count as status effects, then let me know. Aside from that, thank you so much if you've made it this far. These videos take a ton of work to make, and most viewers don't make it to the end, so seriously, thank you. I hope you learned something today, and if there's anything I missed, feel free to let me know in the comments. Aside from all that, feel free to like the video if you enjoyed, dislike if you think it sucked, and subscribe for more videos every century or so. If you ever need to reach me, I have a Discord that can be joined using the link in the description, though I will warn you that spending too much time in there has the same effect on your brain as role-playing as a slinky while going down the stairs. I also normally stream each Sunday at 5:30 PM CST, so feel free to drop by, though my streams aren't nearly as, professional as my normal content. Holy shit. Bear in the Big Blue House reference. I got atomized. I'm actually a Hiroshima reference. That's my shadow after the bombs fell. Who am I kidding? These videos are a mess too. With all that out of the way, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all with my next upload once I come back from getting more cigarettes.